Good evening to all of you. Uh, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you. I'd like to thank Marcus for the invitation. And I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes or so just talking about one of my main lines of research. So I'm a personality psychologist, and I study personality theory. I study uh, character traits from a personality perspective, both moral character and intellectual character traits. But I also study whether our personality can be influenced and changed by the experience of major life events, such as trauma and adversity. And my interest in this work stemmed in part from my upbringing in Sri Lanka, right? So many of you know that Sri Lanka has suffered from multiple ethnopolitical crises over the last 60 years. There was a long-running civil war in particular that lasted from 1983 until 2008. There was also an insurrection, first in 1971 and in 1989 again, where a Marxist group tried to overthrow the government. And I grew up with these conflicts in the backdrop. And as I was completing my education in Sri Lanka, I moved to the US for college. One thing that struck me was, despite all the significant challenges that many people had to undergo and manage through as a result of these conflicts, people managed to maintain, I wouldn't say flourish, but they managed to maintain some degree of function, right? They were able to get through and fulfill the day-to-day responsibilities, manage somehow, right? Despite these severe everyday and chronic traumas they were experiencing. And when I moved to the US, I started thinking about this question of how people managed, right? So, one explanation for why people manage in the wake of severe adversity, and this is an explanation that many of you will not find surprising, is that people turn to religion. There's this nice quote from a book by the social psychologist Keith Payne, who talks about how as the struggles we encounter in life become harder and harder, we start acknowledging just how amazing it is that we can still manage and push through despite the fact that we have those challenges, right? So this quote, the harder life is, the more miraculous it becomes. And interestingly, if you look in the United States, right? So in this paper that Kurt Gray and Dan Wagner published a few years ago, they looked at the relationship between the percentage of people who had a strong belief in God, a strong religious faith. They looked at the correlation between the percentage of people who had a strong religious faith and the extent to which the states that they lived in scored high on a suffering index. And interestingly, there was a strong relationship, a correlation of almost 0.5, which is a strong correlation between the extent to which the average person in that state experienced a high level of suffering and the proportion of people who believed in God. Similarly, in some of the work that I did in Sri Lanka, so this is work I did around 12 years ago, I found that when you asked people who have been affected by the Civil War what helped them stay resilient and push through in the wake of the traumas they'd gone through, religious faith came out as one of the key factors. They also spoke about being able to actively fulfill their family responsibilities and also maintaining a high level of status in their community. But it turns out that religion did function as a source of strength, at least for people who were heavily impacted by the war. Now, when you look at how different religious traditions talk about adversity, now this will not come as a surprise to you, but multiple thinkers in different religious traditions have thought extensively about the role of adversity, right, in our lives. Specifically, the question of why this adversity, right, given that in many religious traditions, there's this idea of a kind, benevolent, higher power. So the books I put up here, right, so this is a book by the British philosopher John Gray, David Distaino, who is a psychologist, and David Wolpe, who's a rabbi. And these books are written by people with very different perspectives. John Gray is an atheist, David Distaino is a psychologist, and David Wolpe is Jewish. But one argument they make that I think is common to all three books is that for many people, religion is important, not necessarily because it gives you a list of rules to live your life by, or it tells you an important story about how the world came to be. For many people, religion is important because it provides an account or an explanation for things that we can't explain ourselves. right? And these things include suffering, adversity, unwarranted struggle. So different religious traditions have, provided accounts for why adversity has value. So, many of you know this, but in theology, there's this question of theodicy, right? Why is there suffering in the world? And different thinkers have come out with accounts as to why suffering exists in the world. So the Christian philosopher Eranda Jayawickreme talks about how the experience of suffering can help us build a closer relationship with God, but also more importantly, can highlight to us, can teach us how human nature, human experience is ultimately fragile, and that we should move past this idea that we are independent, that we can get through the world ourselves by ourselves successfully, and that fundamentally human life is characterized by affliction, by dependence on other people that we love, and by a sense of vulnerability. So there's this idea that the experience of adversity can teach you something important about what it means to be human. Similarly, in the Buddhist tradition, especially in the Mahayana tradition, there's this idea that we can't have flourishing lives until we recognize that suffering is an integral part of life. So for lay Buddhists, the idea that life is suffering, that insight has to be accepted before we can move away from our more egoistic sense of self and move towards a more moral, more compassionate state of being. So we can't achieve flourishing or satisfaction, we can't achieve flourishing until we acknowledge that life is suffering. Now, another insight that some thinkers have argued for is that the experience of adversity can help us build resilience in the face of subsequent challenges. So this is a quote from a book by a religious scholar, Elaine Pagels. She's famous for her work on the Gnostic Gospels. She wrote a book a couple of years ago about the value of religion, in which she, which reflects in part her experience losing her husband and her family members in the prime of their lives. And she talks about how the experience of adversity pushes you, right, forces you to face up to them and push on. And our argument is that, well, without those character strengths, without those abilities, the experience of adversity will destroy you. So in many cases, you have no choice but to face up to adversity. And facing up to adversity can help bring out characteristics that you didn't know you had, or characteristics that were latent in your personality. Now, another argument that's been made, and this has been made by philosophers, is that experiencing adversity or experiencing any event that shifts or disrupts your life has the potential to transform you. So the philosopher Laurie Paul talks about transformative experiences and how they can change you, both in terms of giving you new knowledge that you didn't know before, but also shifting your values and making you reconsider what's important to you in your own life. Now, in the philosophy tradition, there's been relatively little written about how suffering can have value in your life. One recent exception is the philosopher Michael Brady, who wrote a book, Suffering and Virtue, that was published by Oxford a few years ago, and he focuses on specific virtues that can develop through the experience of adversity. One interesting argument he makes here is that there might be certain virtues where suffering and struggle is necessary for the development. So he argues that for certain types of moral fortitude or for humility, sometimes you have to go through certain experiences in order for you to be able to grow on the specific virtues. And this view is consistent with the view presented in certain religious traditions. I'll just give one example here. So the idea in Mahayana Buddhism is that the specific virtues that you can develop by engaging with adversity, so generosity, patience, wisdom, these are some of the personal characteristics that you can develop through the experience of adversity. So I'm sure for many of you have just gone through some work that's very familiar to you. The reason why I want to start with talking about how the link between adversity and our own personality, our own experience is discussed in other traditions is because I want to contrast that with how it's discussed in the psychology literature for the most part. So at least in the United States, there is this pervasive belief that when you go through adversity, it is possible to learn something from it, or it's possible for you to gain benefits from it. So I just want to walk through a couple of examples from the popular media here in the United States. This is an article on a popular news media site, Vox.com, that gives people insights as to how they can deal successfully with grief. One lesson that they discuss is post-traumatic growth, or this idea that you can experience benefits or changes that are positive because of the trauma. This idea that there can be benefits has gotten a lot of traction in the last few years in the US media. This is an article written by Jim Brendan, who subsequently wrote a book about this idea of post-traumatic growth. And this article was published in the New York Times. This is a meme that's that's very popular on the internet. So this idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Now, some of you recognize this as a aphorism from Beyond Good and Evil, Friedrich Nietzsche's book. The full quote is from Life's Rules of War: what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So it raises the question of whether Nietzsche was being sincere or not when he was putting this idea across. Younger people might associate this with the lyrics of the American singer Kelly Clarkson or with Kanye West. But this is a meme that's gotten a lot of traction. And it's sort of presented as in response to adversity, right? As an immediate response. Oh, this bad thing happened, but it's going to make me stronger. I just want to also post this, I think, pretty funny meme that's based in that's taken from the American comic series Futurama. But the idea I want to make place here is that at least in the United States or in North America, this idea that adversity can lead to growth or can lead to benefits pretty quickly is one that's pretty pervasive. So I want to use this contrast between how the value of adversity is discussed in the religion, in the theology, in the philosophy literature, with how it's discussed and studied in the psychology literature. And I'm going to make the argument through 4 lessons that as psychologists, we need to do more credible research on understanding the benefits of adversity and whether, in fact, adversity can help us grow in terms of our personality characteristics. So the 4 lessons I'm going to go through relatively quickly is that we need to have a deeper understanding of what it means to grow. I'll make the argument that, especially in light of some of the methodological innovations associated with the open science movement and the credibility revolution in psychology, that we should take a lot of the research done on post-traumatic growth with a grain of salt. I will then walk through a study that uses a personality perspective on post-traumatic growth to argue that while people can experience growth from adversity, that process is probably more different and maybe harder than we assume it is. I want to end with a call for more rigorous theorizing about how to do research on post-traumatic growth going forward. Okay, so the first lesson about how we typically think about the value of adversity. Now, I mentioned the term post-traumatic growth earlier. Here's a definition. So post-traumatic growth is typically defined in terms of positive psychological changes experienced as a result of struggling with highly challenging life events and life circumstances. This is the definition that's gotten a lot of traction in psychology research. You will see from the definition that it is explicitly a personality-based definition of growth, right? So the idea is that there's something within you that changes. Now, what's interesting about assessing growth is that, especially in contexts where this idea that growth is expected following challenges is seen as normal or seen as normative, it's worth keeping in mind that our responses when we are asked about post-traumatic growth or when we're asked about the impact of adversity on us is probably going to be framed in terms of this narrative. Now, the personality psychologist Dan McAdams wrote this really compelling book back in the mid-1990s called The Redemptive Self. And he talks about how this idea of redemption, right, which in his book he defines as a move from a negative state to a positive state, right? So it's a very simple definition of redemption. This idea that we can move from something negative to something positive is pervasive, especially in contemporary American culture. And he walks through the different domains in which this narrative of redemption plays out. So in religion, the idea of atonement; in political science, the idea of emancipation, right? Which is, again, a very, very compelling narrative in the United States. The notion of upward mobility, the idea of recovery, the notion of enlightenment, right? The idea that we know so much more about the world now compared to the past. And the idea of normative development, right? The idea that, by definition, we're going to grow and become more mature and more wise across time, right? These are frames that are front and center when we go around explain the world to ourselves or explaining our own behaviors, our own experiences to other people. Now, these types of narratives can have value. So, for example, there was a paper that just came out a couple of days ago in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology that showed that to the extent to which Americans saw their lives as a hero's journey, right? So to the extent to which people narrated their lives or thought about their lives in terms of being on a quest, having friends, being exposed to challenges, having those challenges transform you, leaving a legacy for other people. To the extent to which Americans thought of their lives in terms of this journey, they had a greater level of meaning in their lives. Now, the problem, though, is that these types of narratives frequently serve to provide social scripts for how we talk about our lives, right? So the idea here is that the notion of post-traumatic growth can function as a master narrative. In other words, when we talk about everyday lives, we assume that we need to talk about our lives in the context of this particular type of cultural framing so that other people see us as a good member of culture. Now, I'll walk through an example to clarify what I mean here. So imagine that you have just gone through a breakup and you're having brunch with friends soon after your breakup. And your friends are trying to cheer you up, right? They're trying to say, well, there are plenty more fish in the sea. That person wasn't good for you anyway. You can hang out with us more now. You have more me time. And imagine that you said, no, this is all terrible. None of those things sound appealing to me. This sucks. This is the worst thing that ever happened to me. Now, your friends might be, if your friends are good friends, they may not tell this to your face, but they might think, well, this person doesn't have the right attitude. This person, like something seems up, like something seems out of order here because this person isn't responding to what we're saying in the right way. And the reason why they might have that response is that there's an expectation that even when something bad has happened to you, when you talk to people about it, you're going to say, oh, don't worry, this bad thing happened, but I'm going to put my best foot forward. I'm going to recover. I'm going to be better than ever, right? Even though the reason why you're saying that is not because that's how you feel, but because that's how you're expected to talk. In other words, it's a cultural script. A similar example from my move from Sri Lanka to the United States was when I was walking down to a farmer's market in Pennsylvania, and people would stop me and say good morning and ask me how I was doing. And I would say, oh, I'm doing well. I would tell them about how my day was going. I would give them some insights about my challenges in my classes. And then after a while, I realized that when Americans stopped me to ask how I was doing, I was supposed to just say fine and be done with it, right? Not because they didn't care about how I was doing, but because there's a certain social norm about how you interact with each other. So you ask someone how they're doing, they say, oh, I'm doing well. How are you? You say you're fine, and you move on. So the reason why I bring this up is that there's a unique challenge to studying post-traumatic growth when there's a cultural norm around how you're supposed to respond to questions about your experience of adversity. Now, there's a lot of this research looking at the role of redemption has been done in North America. There's been relatively limited research about whether this narrative predominates in other countries, like in Western European countries or in other parts of the world. My guess is that this narrative probably takes different flavors. So there might be a focus on redemption at a collective level rather than individual level. But this fact has specific implications for how we can credibly study post-traumatic growth. Okay, so that's my first point. The second point I want to make is a lot of current research into post-traumatic growth isn't very good from a methodological standpoint. Now, a lot of research that studies post-traumatic growth has used assessments where people are asked, how much do you think you've changed as a result of the adversity? Now, from a face value perspective, it seems pretty straightforward. It sounds like a question you might ask a friend or a question a therapist could ask a client. Do you think the trauma has changed you? Now, the problem with that is that if you're interested in understanding someone's story about adversity, or story about their lives, then maybe asking people about it is the best way to go. But if you want to know whether the event itself has changed a person, simply asking people about their experience may not be the best way to go. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a few minutes. But for now, I want to say that there's a disconnect between how post-traumatic growth has been conceptualized, and as I said earlier, it's been conceptualized in terms of personality change, and how it's been measured. Because for the most part, it's been measured through assessments like this. So these are 5 items from the post-traumatic growth inventory. This is the most widely used measure of post-traumatic growth. It taps 5 domains of growth: greater appreciation of life, realization of new possibilities in your life, increased sense of personal strength, increased religious faith, and better appreciation of your relationships. And typically people are asked, okay, how much do you think your life has changed for the better as a result of the trauma? And you rate yourself on a 0 to 6 scale. So you haven't changed at all, or you've changed a lot. Now, as I said, this is a very face valid measure. But when you consider what you're supposed to do in order to accurately provide a response to this measure, things become a little more complicated. So let's say you ask me, do you think you become a stronger person after going through a traumatic experience? For me to give you an accurate response, I would think about, okay, how am I doing now? What's my current level of personality? Okay, how was I doing before the trauma? Well, can I remember what my personality was back then? Okay, how does my present state compare with my past state? Have I gotten better? Have I gotten worse? Okay, if I've gotten better or worse, how much have I changed, right? So you can do some math in your head. And then, okay, I think I've changed. How much of that change is due to the trauma? Now, we know from past research that we don't always have good sense into why we process the mental experiences that we do, right? So this is famous paper in Psychological Review from the 1970s called Telling More Than We Can Know, right? Where we are able to come up with explanations for why we change, but those explanations don't necessarily have any basis in the reality. So even if we are able to accurately perceive how much we change from the past to the present, we probably don't know whether that change has occurred because of the trauma or because of some other process. So it's not obvious that these measures are good at tracking change. Now, one way you can test the validity of these types of measures is to not only ask a person whether they've changed, but to ask other people whether they've changed as well. So if I tell you that I've become a better person because of the trauma, and my wife and my friends and my family all agree with me, then that's evidence that maybe there's some basis in reality for my beliefs. Now, we've done multiple studies looking at the extent to which self-reports of post-traumatic growth can be corroborated by close others. These are results from people who've gone through a clinical trauma in North Carolina. You want to look at the correlations on the left because we asked about post-traumatic growth. We also asked a set of questions about whether their lives had changed for the worse. We call that post-traumatic depreciation. And at least for post-traumatic growth, we didn't find evidence of agreement. In other words, if I said that I had changed for the better, on average, people who knew that person well did not agree with them. We did a similar study with survivors of the Sri Lankan Civil War. Now, there are a lot of correlations here. The one I want you to pay attention to are in the center here. So the correlation between people's own reports of post-traumatic growth and the people who knew them well was around 0.2, which is a very modest correlation, especially if you believe that people's self-reports should be based in reality. So it turns out that at least when you compare people's own reports of post-traumatic growth to those of people who know them well, you don't see strong evidence for agreement. Another way in which you could test as to whether these measures are valid is to look at the relationship between what people report and how they experience growth-relevant domains in their daily life. So in this study, we tracked the whole university population of Wake Forest students. If any of them experienced a major traumatic life event, we asked them if they could take part in an experience sampling study. So in experience sampling studies, when you ask someone multiple times a day, what are you doing right now? Right? What's your current experience? And what we did is that we created a measure asking about 5 domains of post-traumatic growth, the 5 domains that I mentioned earlier. And we looked at the relationship between their scores of post-traumatic growth and their manifestations of growth, what we call as assessed by this measure. And what we found was that only spirituality, what we call post-traumatic growth report to spirituality, tracked their daily behavior. For the other 4 domains, people's perceptions of growth, as measured by the post-traumatic growth inventory, was not related to their everyday behavior. Now, one argument you could make is that, okay, maybe people's beliefs about growth don't track their actual change, but maybe there is value to their beliefs, right? Maybe there's a self-fulfilling prophecy at stake, where if I believe I've grown, over time I will grow, right? So maybe there are benefits to believing that you've changed, even though those beliefs aren't corroborated by actual personality change. Now, unfortunately, what we know is that in the short term, at least, it seems that having these beliefs that you've grown are associated with poorer mental health. So this is a study looking at veterans from the Iraq War. So these are veterans that come back from the Iraq War. It turned out that beliefs having high levels of post-traumatic growth predicted subsequent increases in symptoms of post-traumatic stress. in our own work, so I'll go through this quickly, but we were interested in whether, okay, if you believe you've grown on these 5 domains of post-traumatic growth, does that subsequently lead to changes on your current standing on those 5 domains of post-traumatic growth, right? So does it have a self-fulfilling prophecy for those 5 domains of post-traumatic growth? And we assess people's trait post-traumatic growth, both using a trait measure and also using aggregated state assessment. So using our experience sampling assessment and aggregating the states across 3 time points. And what we found was for both the state trait assessment and for the aggregated state assessment, believing that you had changed did not predict subsequent change on your on those 5 post-traumatic growth domains. So even if you accept the fact that these perceived growth measures don't track actual change, and you think, well, maybe there's some benefit to having these beliefs, at least in the short term, it turns out that these beliefs, if anything, have a negative impact on your mental health. So this, from a psychological perspective, raises an interesting question about what these assessments of beliefs about growth actually assess, right? So to some extent, maybe these measures are tapping into actual growth, right? To some extent, maybe when people respond to these measures, maybe they are using a cultural script, right? So when I'm looking at a measure like this, I'm saying, okay, have I grown? Have I not grown? I might be thinking, okay, how much does the average person grow? Well, I'm an average person. So maybe the average person grows at 3 out of a 7. So that's how I'm going to respond on the scale. So maybe I'm not really telling you what my experience is like. I'm just giving you what I think is an appropriate cultural response. Now, it's also possible that as you go to an adverse experience, that adverse experience shifts your identity. You have to sort of integrate that experience and potentially change your sense of self. It might be that to some extent, this measure is tapping into the early stages of that, right? So as your subjective sense of identity has been shifted through experience of the life event, these measures might be reflecting that those change to some extent. What also could be happening is that your scores of perceived growth might reflect a coping strategy. Now, it turns out that if you look at the coping literature in psychology, one coping strategy that in fact has some benefits is positive reappraisal. And one form of positive reappraisal is looking for benefits in the experience. So, oh, this terrible thing happened, I failed the exam, but at least this has taught me that I need to study harder. Or it taught me that I need to sort of spend more time at school, taking my studies seriously. So the idea behind looking for benefits in the wake of adversity is that it helps you gain some control over the event. So you feel less like the event is pushing you around, or you feel less out of control. But also it lessens the impact, because if you're able to say all these terrible things happened, but at least some good things happen as well, you don't see the negative event as so impactful on your personality. So it might be that there might be a jangle fallacy going on here, where we think we're assessing post-traumatic growth, but what we actually are assessing is a form of coping. Moreover, it could be that these measures might be assessing maladaptive coping. Or in other words, these measures might be assessing self-enhancement in the immediate aftermath of adversity. In other words, we might be in denial about the effect of the adversity on our lives. So after something happens, we say, oh, I've gotten stronger. I've learned so much. I'm going to become stronger from this. And it takes a few months for the shoe to drop, for you to realize, oh no, I'm actually struggling. So the 2 takeaways, I think, from this slide. One is that we don't know which of these explanations work for any given study on post-traumatic growth, right? These are all potential sources of variance, use a psychological term, in people's reports of growth. And because we don't quite know what information people are relying on when they're reporting their measures of growth, this makes this a very bad measure from a measurement standpoint. Because in any given study, that means we don't know what we're assessing when we're giving people these measures of post-traumatic growth. Okay, so the third lesson builds on this idea that we need to move away from standard assessment of post-traumatic growth and adopt the methods of personality to think about how people might change. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this idea that we can do better research on post-traumatic growth by understanding post-traumatic growth in terms of personality change. Now, last year, I had the opportunity to work with Cornelia Frues, who's a personalized psychologist at Heidelberg, and a friend of mine, Nick Westrate, on this paper, like creating a framework for how we think people can change their personality in the wake of going through a negative life event or traumatic life event. And we spoke about how people can change at different levels of their personality. So they could change in terms of their traits or in terms of their dispositional thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. They could change in terms of the goals they have in their life, or they could change in terms of their subjective sense of identity. And we also spoke about potential mechanisms that might work. And one sort of mechanism we spoke about involved how the life event can change our everyday experiences. And through the shift in our everyday thoughts and experiences, over time, those shifts become habitual. Now, one thing to think about when we think about how these shifts can happen is that we don't have a strong theoretical framework for understanding the timeline for these shifts, right? So I was just going to mention two things in two points here. One is that if you want to make a claim that adversity can lead to personality growth, you need to be able to make the case and empirically deduce that that shift happened over and above normative change, right? That there's something about the way in which our personality shifted that can be explained by the trauma itself, as opposed to other normative processes. Another thing to keep in mind is that we don't know what the trajectory of change is because we don't have strong theory about it. We don't know whether it's gradual, which is a lot, what many developmental theories would argue for. And there's a lot of intuition that if you learn benefits from adversity, it doesn't happen immediately, it takes time. But it's also possible that maybe some people can experience sudden gains, right? Maybe they can experience changes in the immediate aftermath. There's also this nice distinction between short-term change, where you in the short term you sort of change, but then over time your personality pulls you back down. And then this type of change ends up being habitual, where you change, and because of changes in your psychology or changes in your environment, those changes get scaffolded. Now, I don't have a strong opinion about which one of those counts most growth compared to the other. I think they're both interesting phenomena. But we also need to think more about those different types of change and whether different types of life events promote one type of change, short-term change, over another, long-term, more habitual change. Now, I just want to focus on going back to this idea that the event, the stressful life event, can lead to shifts in our habitual thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. I want to talk about this idea in terms of psychological states. So I'm a personality psychologist. I've done a lot of conceptual work, thinking about personality in terms of distributions of behavior, right? So when you talk about my personality and you talk about me as extroverted, what you really mean is that on average, across multiple situations, I tend to be extroverted. Now, what that means is that in some cases, like right now, I'm very extroverted because I know being extroverted makes for a good talk. But in other contexts, I'm less extroverted because there might be social norms. I might be, even by my standards, I might be tired. So the idea is that we fluctuate from moment to moment in our personality, despite the fact that over time, you do see these stable dispositions. Now, on this view, the way in which trauma or adversity or any life event can impact you is by changing the underlying mechanisms for these distributions of behavior. So when you go through a stressful life event, one thing that can happen is that it can change the goals that you have. It can change the strength of the links between the goals you have and your behavior. And it can lead to shifts in your overall distribution of personality, which over time, depending on the impact of the event, depending on changes to your the extent to which it shifts the mechanisms underlying your personality, depending on the situations that scaffold your behaviors, those shifts might become habitual. So in an initial test of this, we ran an intensive longitudinal study with a large representative US sample. We assessed them every week for 1 year, excluding major US holidays, and we give them assessments of major life events. So every week we ask them, in the last week, have you gone through a major life event? We created a 5-item measure of post-traumatic growth based on the 5 domains of post-traumatic growth. And we asked them, tell us your current levels on those five domains of post-traumatic growth. We had additional questions on the types of social events that experienced that day, the overall well-being in the context of the social events. And there's the other analyses I'm happy to talk about briefly in the Q&A. But for this presentation, I was interested in, do people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors as assessed by states of PTG? Do you see a shift in the immediate aftermath of going through a major life event? So we ran a series of what are called longitudinal growth models. I'll just give the summary here. On average, we saw evidence for resilience, not for growth. On average, we saw people after they reported a major life event, on average, they exhibited stability. Now, there's all variation. If you look at the 5 items of post-traumatic growth that tap the 5 domains, these are just exploratory analyses. But if anything, there was evidence for an immediate decline in feelings of personal strength or mastery, which you think about it makes sense, right? When you go through a stressful life event, the first thing that happens likely you think, oh my God, can I handle this? Can I go through this? So if anything, through this exploratory analysis, we found that in the immediate aftermath of adversity, people struggle in terms of their sense of self-efficacy. Now, I should note that there was a lot of variation, right? So there was a lot of what we call variability, right, in people's scores. And in follow-up work, we will be looking at sort of what we call idiographic or individual trajectories to see whether some people exhibited a growth pattern consistent with growth. But the lesson here is that, at least in the immediate aftermath, people don't seem to report immediate increases in domains associated with post-traumatic growth. Now, you might think, especially those of you who are dementally inclined, might think, well, that's not surprising. Why would you expect increases in the immediate aftermath? But it's worth noting that in many studies that use standard assessments of post-traumatic growth, a large majority of people tend to report post-traumatic growth using these measures, right? So in a recent study looking at, I think, Canadian healthcare workers in the wake of COVID, almost 80% of people said, oh, I've reported some degree of growth using these measures. So we need better research on post-traumatic growth. And I also think we need a better understanding of what it means to grow in the first place. So I will say, this idea of whether there's value to adversity, whether we can grow from adversity, whether there can be personality growth from adversity, it's a very compelling research question. Religious thinkers, theologians have grappled with this question for millennia, right? Psychological scientists have only started grappling with this question over the last 30 years. And one of the arguments I've made in this talk is that we need to do a better job of it. We need just to give you some ideas for future research. What is the value of these assessments of perceived growth, right? What is the value of assessing perceptions of growth, given that it doesn't seem to track actual changes in your personality and it doesn't seem to have any functional benefit? I think when we think about how personality growth can occur in the wake of trauma, and this is something that many of you are interested in, it's worth thinking about how our personality would change and what it would mean for our personality to change at different levels. Now, intuitively, I would think that if someone's personality did grow in the wake of adversity, you would see changes in some of my dispositional thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So, for example, I might become more compassionate. I might increase my goal to be more compassionate. So you would see change in terms of my characteristics and adaptations. And maybe I would center compassion in my identity. So I might shift my sense of identity so that I center compassion and maybe other virtues. Now, one thing that can happen, however, is that because we're motivated to cope with trauma in the immediate aftermath of it, one thing we might do is that we might create a shift in identity where we say, oh, I went through this trauma, I learned so much, I've become stronger. But that shift in your sense of identity isn't accompanied by changes in your everyday behavior or changes in your goal. And this would be an example of misalignment. And I think there's an interesting theoretical question here about what it means for someone to grow in terms of your subjective identity, but not in terms of your beliefs or in terms of your behavior. And this is something maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. We clearly need more varied assessments and we need high quality studies. Many of the studies that are done don't use the right types of assessments. So to give you one example, we need to use assessments that are sensitive to the types of change people may experience. And a lot of the measures we use, especially in personality, are not sufficiently sensitive. We need studies that last multiple years so we can get a better handle on the types of trajectories of change people might experience. I think we need to have a less simplistic understanding of what it means to grow. This is especially a problem in the US. We have something of a superhero mentality when it comes to adversity, that somehow by going through adversity, you're going to become stronger, like a superhero. We also need a clear understanding of the characteristics on which we change. You might have noticed from the earlier part of my presentation that there were multiple virtues, multiple personality characteristics that philosophers and theologians and religious thinkers have highlighted that psychologists don't study, right? There are multiple virtues out there that we haven't looked at. So it might be that we need to focus on those attributes like compassion and humility. Similarly, I think psychologists need to question the term growth or at least clarify what it means. Because at least among psychologists or among many lay people, when you say you experience post-traumatic growth, there's this assumption that you're in some way better off overall, that you're somehow a better person. Whereas what I think might happen is that people might indeed grow in certain virtues. So going through adversity might make you more humble, might make you more compassionate, might make you wiser. But you also might have to deal with other negative implications of the trauma, right? So you can imagine how I could be more compassionate and more kind in the wake of going to an event, but maybe I still struggle with my mental health. Maybe I've experienced impaired relationships with my family. So I think we need to have a more subtle understanding of post-traumatic growth. I think from an empirical standpoint, I think the idea of just looking at change to see whether people change in different attributes is good enough. And then maybe the philosophers and the theologians can tell us, well, does that count as growth or not? I should also note, and this is important, that we need to think about what domains count as growth in different cultures and different contexts. We've just finished up a paper showing that, at least in Rwanda, among genocide survivors in Rwanda, when you ask them about domains of growth that are important to them, psychological constructs don't come up as highly. They talk a lot more about education, about opportunities for employment, about opportunities to improve their material well-being. I think relationships is on the list, but it's, I think, third or fourth on the list. So when we talk about the benefits of adversity, it's worth taking a step back and thinking whether certain cultures might prioritize psychological growth over other domains of growth. And if so, that assumption may not hold across different cultures. Some more some other points to keep in mind from a research standpoint. We need to move beyond the single trauma framework. This idea that a single event can change you. It comes from a very particular definition of trauma that's based in Western understandings, where most people are lucky not to go through multiple traumatic events in their lives. Whereas I can tell you from the experience of people in Sri Lanka and other countries, people go through multiple life events. And also, even in the US and in Western cultures, adverse events tend to cluster together, such that most people don't experience many adverse events in their lifetimes, which is good. But for the people who do, they tend to experience multiple events, and they tend to cluster together. You also need to figure out what is it about the event that can foster change, right? And this, I think, for those of us interested in personality growth, this is an important fact. Post-traumatic growth assumes that it's a negative impact of the event that changes you, but there might be other factors, such as the extent to which you had control over the event, the extent to which you selected into the event, and we need to measure those more systematically. And there's some really cool work by Michael Lerman on this. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, even though on average you might not see change, there might be some people for whom the experience of adversity easily leads to change. This is work that we're doing more work on this with the existing data we have, and I think this is also an area for research, for increased research. So I just want to end by mentioning a few things, right? So I think there's something uniquely challenging about doing work on post-traumatic growth. This is an area where people have very strong intuitions that that trauma can lead to growth. And that means that we might have very strong theoretical commitments that aren't backed up by the science. And I think, among other things, this has led to a confirmation bias where we've accepted all too easily poor quality research because it fits in with our intuitions. That said, I also want to acknowledge that in doing this type of research, we need to be mindful that many people have the lived experience of growth, and that we should not downplay that or dismiss that. At the same time, I think, especially in the US, in the US context, this narrative or this idea that you can grow from adversity can lead to blaming the victim, because people can think, oh, I'm not only supposed to get over this event and manage with it, apparently I'm also supposed to grow from it, right? And gain benefits from it. So I think there is a challenge of being sensitive to people's lived experience, but also acknowledging that sometimes these beliefs can be burdensome for people. I also want to end with a really interesting meta-science observation, which is that critique of this research stems back all the way to 1996. When the early studies on post-traumatic growth were gaining traction, there were people critiquing this research. And for some reason, these critiques have not gained traction. So I think it's very interesting to think about how, as scientists, right, even though we're scientists committed to the scientific method, we're also human, right, with our own values and our own biases. And I think we always have to manage those two, right, manage our own beliefs, our own sort of commitments, as well as what the data tells us and the quality of that evidence. So that's something I think that makes doing work on post-traumatic growth especially challenging. I want to thank my collaborators, especially Laura Blackie, Kelly Brenner, and Megan Gaggle. They were postdocs in various ground I've had that helped with much of this work. I want to thank my lab members. I want to thank the various funders, including the Templeton Philanthropies. And I want to thank you all for your time.
Yeah, let's open the discussion. Are there any questions? Ryan.
Thanks so much for your talk. I really appreciated it. That was wonderful and compelling. My question is about the study that you described, where you had a representational sample, and your main aim was you're looking at the relationship between measured growth and using the PTGI. And I guess you found that there's no relationship between the negative events and growth and measured growth, right?
Right.
But my question though is, I'm curious if you did find any relationships between measured growth and some other variable that was included in the study.
All right. So were there any predictors of change of measured growth across time? Is that your question?
Like measured growth after a traumatic event, yeah.
Right, and that's a good question. So that we've done some additional analyses, and these analyses looked at well-being. So we had some additional items, and those that broader well-being measure included these measured growth items, right? I mean, what we find is that the experience of so let me try and remember what we found, because it's been a little while since we looked at so here's what we found. What we found was that the experience of major life events did lead to a shift in your experience of daily social events, right? So not necessarily your experience of growth, right? But it seemed that the big impact that the major life events had is that it led to a shift downwards of your of the quality of your social events, right? So there's something about going through the event that change your everyday interactions, right? Now that could happen for a number of different reasons, right? It could happen because your attitude towards the events has changed, so you're not getting as much out of those events, right? So maybe you're dealing with the fallout from the major life event, you're feeling down about it, and that had an impact on the daily social events you have, right? You experience more negative events and fewer social events. But also, if your levels of well-being went down, that then had this like dynamic impact where your subsequent experience of social events would also further decrease. So one of the main like positive results that we found in this study was actually a pretty negative one, which is that the experience of major life events shifts your experience of everyday social events, which then in turn shifts your level of well-being downwards, which in turn leads to a further shift in your social events downwards. So that was the main finding that was the main significant finding that we found. That paper's coming out in the Journal of Personality. In terms of other predictors of, I'm trying to think of other questions we could ask of the data, right? So I'm trying to answer your question directly, right, about whether there are potential explanations. One thing we have not looked at is inter-individual predictors or inter-individual moderators, right? So we haven't looked at whether certain personality traits might moderate these trajectories. So for example, right, maybe people who are high on openness to experience, people who are high on the personality trait of extroversion, right? It's possible that your trait level at the beginning of that study might predict increased trajectory, right? And we're hoping to run this analysis probably in the next couple of months.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, Ryan, I feel like that was a bit of a rambling answer to your question.
Okay, some other questions?
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was intrigued about when towards the end of your talk, you wondered if maybe aspects of trauma leads to personality growth rather than just trauma per se, trauma simplicity. And from a personal perspective, I was wondering if maybe agency brings anything to bear on trauma. For example, ending a personal relationship, although traumatic, I've been able to reflect on it and actually realize what I want from other relationships, be more affirming of myself, and it's a very healthy decision long term. But another traumatic event, we had an home invasion when I was a child, and I had no agency. Perhaps the only agency I had was in suppressing my emotions. I felt nothing, not even fear. So, and that, I don't think I've had any growth from that experience. Only just flashbacks and an obsessive obsession about security. So yes, does agency play a part in how we process trauma long term?
I mean, that's an excellent question. And my answer will be likely yes. So we know from the clinical literature, right, that events that where you feel like you were the personal victim of are much harder to manage with than events that you feel like you weren't targeted, right? So to give one example, being the victim of a violent assault versus being in an earthquake, right? So when you're in an earthquake, you don't know what, it's act of God, you don't know why it happened. It happened to other people, so you have a sense of community, you can talk to other people about it. I think those types of events are much more likely to lend themselves to personality growth than an event where you feel you're targeted by like something evil and malevolent, right? So I definitely agree with this idea that there's something about your sense of agency being violated that's important. I think it's also true that there needs to be a taxonomy, right, of the types of events and the characters of events that would maybe lend themselves more to growth than others, right? So, for example, as you mentioned, right, being helpless in the wake of an invasion and managing with that, right? If I make a prediction, I would expect that maybe you can grow from that. Maybe some people could, but my expectation was that most people would probably just have to manage with that, right, the best they can. Whereas in a situation where you are going through an adverse event, but it's one that you've sort of chosen, like your example, going through a breakup, one thing you can do in the context of that is that you can reflect on your values, right? Even when you're struggling, you can reflect on the reasons why you did that. You can feel like, I stayed true to myself, right? This is struggling, this sucks, but at some level, I know I'm doing this for my own good. And that can provide like a resource, right? When you're managing what I call with the impact of that breakup. Now, I should note that we have done some research looking at this construct called personal growth initiative, or the extent to which you are committed to personal self-development. And we find that at least in Rwanda, it predicted better mental health and improved functioning. In Sri Lanka, it predicted better mental health. People who were in both Sri Lanka and Rwanda who were high in this construct had more hope for the future. They saw their future happiness as higher compared to people knowing the construct. So, I mean, I will say that to the extent to which people's level of dispositional agency to work with themselves, right? Work with themselves is higher. There seems to be some evidence that might play a protective factor when weathering challenging life events.
Thank you.
I would like to hook up on this question because agency is somehow related conceptually to extroversion, which you already mentioned. You conduct research on extroversion and growth. Now, you investigated personality states with respect to extroversion. And I wonder if you looked into facets, because, for example, agency is about more strongly related to a particular facet of extroversion, like assertion, self-assertion. Extroversion also has other facets like being talkative and socializable. So have you looked into these facets to get a better picture of what might help to grow after adversity? Is it talking to others? Is it being outgoing, approaching new people, being active in any other way, or whatever, more affiliative?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. And I will say, thinking about the big 5 measures we have at intake and at the end of our studies, we don't have sufficient coverage of the facets. As we have not looked at this question of facets in our study. And and going back to my point about using the types of assessments that are sensitive to change. Now, I'll say a little more about that. So a lot of trait assessments are written in a very traded manner. So they ask about, how in general, how do you describe yourself? And it'll be a bunch of adjectives, right? Whereas I think if you're interested in looking at whether people do change, you might be better off creating a measure, a version of that measure is a little more sensitive to change. So in the last 2 weeks, this is how you see yourself, right? So you can actually, to the extent which there are fluctuations in your dispositional behavior across time, you can capture that, because the problem with the traded measure is that traded measures are very strongly tied to our self-concept, and our self-concept doesn't change that quickly. So you can imagine in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, you actually might experience changes in your dispositional behaviors, but your self-concept hasn't updated to that yet, right? You still see yourself as a highly extroverted person or not particularly open person, so that's what you report. Now, speaking more directly to your question, I think related to this, I think it is important that we look at facets, because it might be that even if you don't see change at the big five on average, the fact that you don't see change might be hiding the fact that if you look at specific facets, there might be some facets that are that are more sensitive to change over time, right? So I think that's definitely an area for future research. And unfortunately, in a lot of the studies that I've done, I haven't collected big five data with a broad enough breadth such that I can look at facets.
Well, I have another question.
Yeah.
So I wonder, or actually I think that the special kind of negative event may matter in order not to compare apples with oranges. So, for example, if you are a person who is highly emotionally dependent, which might be a facet of neuroticism or whatever, so a breakup matters more than a job loss, maybe. And so for a person with a high conscientiousness or achievement motive, the work loss may matter more. So there may be many interactions and conditional factors, moderators that play a role, and which may also be different after a breakup versus after job loss. So I wonder whether we do not mix too much things with one another, and how you think couldn't it be very worth to only concentrate on one special kind of event and narrow things down? Well, for sure, the more specific a stimulus is, like an event or what we measure, the better. But I wonder how you think about it.
No, that's an excellent point, Marcus. And I think that there are two ways of looking at it, right? So one way in which you could narrow it down is to focus on one type of event, right? And you could still look at how impactful the event was for people, but at least that way, that at least everyone was exposed to the same event. So, for example, my work looking at Rwandan genocide survivors, right? Or some of my intervention work on post-traumatic growth that looked at people who had gone through bereavement, right? So those are examples where we focus on one type of experience, right? The focus is on one type of experience. Now, the problem there is that you're assuming that that experience was in some way impactful for people, right? Even though you would try and measure to what degree, but the baseline assumption is that this was an impactful event for everyone. And that might not be true, right? Some people might go through a bereavement and not really feel terrible about what happened, right? Because of their relationship with the person. Another way of doing it, I guess, is to look at a wider range of events, but measure the extent to which that event, and this builds on something you said earlier, Marcus, assess the extent to which that the impact of the event hit at their identity. So there's a measure that's used in the clinical literature called event centrality. So to what extent does the event impact your sense of identity? Maybe you've seen a couple of studies and we didn't actually find anything, we didn't find it predicted anything. But in principle, right, if you would imagine that major life events that had a stronger impact your sense of identity, so like the emotionally sensitive person who goes through a breakup, right? That event would be an event that hit at the heart of that person's identity. You would have expected that event would be able to sort of identify a key characteristic of the event that potentially would argue for a role for that event in fostering personality change and maybe for personality growth. So, I see two different potential ways of going forward.
Thanks a lot, Eranda. Here are two more questions. I don't know.
Thank you. That was a great talk. I want to focus on one specific type of trauma or challenge that people face, various kinds of mental illnesses. And it seems to me that especially in the psychotherapy literature, but also to some extent in the philosophy literature, people want to frame these kinds of experiences as you mentioned, transformative experiences.
Yeah.
But as you pointed out later on, this might add a specific kind of normative expectation to the treatment of these issues. So normally when a person is treated for cancer, for instance, the assumption is not that after you get better, you are somehow a better person, or you somehow overcome something so big that you're better and you're expected to be such. Whereas that's quite often the case in let's say people trying to get around depression or something like that, and that is supposed to be a hopeful perspective for them. But it can also be a kind of normative burden, because then people expect you to not only get better, but from the problem, get rid of the problem, but actually somehow change in this enlightening way that you're now more wise or something like that. So my question is, how does one go about addressing this in the treatment of trauma? So addressing this kind of normative expectation. Well, that's one question. But the other question is, have you noticed the same thing, that this is quite a widespread, this idea?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I'll address the last part of your question and move on to the first. So a few years ago, there was this American writer who actually passed away a few years, maybe last year, Barbara Ehrenreich. She wrote a book called Bright-Sided, and it was pretty much an attack on positive psychology. And she came in, she interviewed my former, so my research advisor in graduate school was Marty Seligman. She came and interviewed him while I was in his lab. And part of the reason why she wrote the book was that she got diagnosed with cancer. She started attending the support groups, and she found this idea that you have to grow and become stronger as a result of the cancer intolerable. Like, she hated it. She's like, why? Like, this is just so much pressure. Cancer sucks. I don't want it to kill me. I want to get over it and get back to my life. Like, I don't need the cancer to teach me anything, right? So part of the rationale of writing that book was this sort of reaction to this idea that, wow, like, not only are we supposed to manage with bad things, but we're supposed to learn from them as well. So it is widespread. It's widespread. I think there are cultural differences. I remember when I was talking to my mom about my research, and my mom's like, she's Sri Lankan, she's a devout Catholic, and she said, why do you have to learn good things and bad things? Bad things are bad things, right? You just deal with them and move on, right? Like, why do you need to make anything more of it? But so in terms of how you manage with it, right? So I'll say, I guess I have a more nuanced response. I do think when you're managing, in the early days of managing with people's like challenges, it's important just to focus on those challenges and alleviating those challenges and validating their experience. Now, I do think that for some people, maybe talking about how, like, the ways in which you can move on from this, I would probably not use the growth language, but talk about how people have different insights that they may not have had before, right? I remember doing some interviews with counselors in Sri Lanka a few years ago, and one thing they said about when I asked them, they said, value to talk about positive psychology, it's the value talking about resilience and growth, and they said yes, because in the context that they're in, people are going through terrible things all the time, and if they came to the counselor every day and just spoke about these terrible things, they would get really depressed. So the counselors really appreciate the fact that, look, we are able to talk about like resilience, or talk about ways in which maybe you're benefited, or talk about the areas of your life where you think there's something good happening because of what happened, right? It gives them an extra tool in their toolkit, right? So I'm not saying that it's always bad to talk about insights you can learn or ways in which you can see the world differently. There are people talk about, I think there's a philosophy book that came out recently. I forget who the author is, but the title of the book was Life is Hard. It was a sort of a popular philosophy book. Yeah. Exactly, yes. So he writes about how hope is the outcome, right? Like, life is hard, sometimes bad things happen, you can't explain them, but ultimately you have to live in hope, or live with the idea that in the future things are going to be better, right? Or things can be better. Things can be better, not will be better, but can be better, right? And those are types of insights that can come to you through the experience of adversity, right? Similar to the point I made earlier in my talk about how, in the Christian tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, in virtue ethics, there's this idea that there's certain insights, advantages you can learn about life as a result of going through it, right? I think it's probably not helpful to talk about it in terms of growth, right? I think I would resist the idea that somehow someone's expected to be a better person overall. But I think there are ways in which you can talk about insights, but that's something I think ideally should be led by the client, right? It's not something you should try and impose, and definitely not try and impose too early.